I'm Lisa Keränen. I'm an associate professor and director of graduate studies in communication at the University of Colorado, Denver, and I'm also excited to be an associate of the program for arts and humanities in healthcare. In terms of ARST, I'm the incoming president and 2012 ARST Bicentennial Preconference Planner.
So it was your idea for the 20th anniversary of ARST to do oral histories with some of the founders of ARST and some of the luminaries of the field. Can you talk a little bit about why you thought of that and what role you thought maybe the oral history might play in future scholarship and histories of the field?
One of the reasons that I was thinking about the Oral History Project was that I wanted to be able to keep generations of scholars who were moving into new phases of their lives in conversation with up-and-coming scholars in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. And so I knew that John Angus Campbell and David Depew, for example, were retired, and yet I think that they had so much to offer, and that bringing them back to talk about their roles seemed really appropriate and fitting for a 20th anniversary celebration. So it was part of paying tribute to our past, seeing its connections to the future, but also just really wanting to document for ARST members some of the key debates to bring those alive for future generations of students who maybe read some of the classical essays but don't have as much of the context in terms of what the conversations were at the time. So it was my idea to do the Oral History Project, and I was so thrilled that Damon Pfister agreed to help out and has done really wonderful work with it, because I just wanted to bring together these different generations in the rhetoric of science. Secondarily, I also wanted to have video for rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine classes. I thought, how cool would it be if when we read someone's essay, we could then go online to YouTube or the ARST page and actually see video with some of these leading scholars.
So can you talk a little about the history of ARST and your involvement in it?
The Association for the Rhetoric of Science and Technology was founded in 1992, and it was actually the American Association for the Rhetoric of Science, which had a funny-sounding acronym. So then it became the American Association for the Rhetoric of Science and Technology, and eventually, I believe in 2006, we dropped American from the title, signaling our increasing internationalization and our particularly members from Canada and Europe who are interested in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. My involvement with ARST started in 1997 when I was a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh. And as a newbie, I didn't even know how old it was, but I knew that John Line had a whole gaggle of graduate students who came. I believe it was in Chicago that year, but don't quote me. But I have this early memory of John Angus Campbell trotting us all out to Bergdorf's or Berghoff's, that famous German restaurant in Chicago. And we had just a wonderful dinner there, a sort of coming together. And what I was really struck by was the amazing intellectual energy and camaraderie. And so the group at that time, David Depew and John Angus Campbell, and I think Celeste Condit was there, although memory might be hazy, but there was such a sense of goodwill and engagement and genuine interest in intellectual issues in the rhetoric of science. And I've seen ARST's fortunes sort of wax and wane over the years, but I'm really excited this year about all of the scholars that we brought together and the kind of dynamism and energy and hope for our future as we meet the challenges in the coming years. I should say that I've also been involved with ARST in a leadership role since at least 1998 or 9 when I started helping out with pre-conferences, but I've been an ARST treasurer for a number of years. I've been on the board of governors for a very long time, and then more recently in formal leadership roles. So my history with ARST actually dates back 15 years.
What are some memorable moments from past ARST meetings? Either particular presentations or controversies that still stand out for you?
Sure. One of the most memorable ARST pre-conferences was when we brought Chris Mooney, author of The Republican War on Science, to an ARST pre-conference and had a wonderful conversation about the politicization of science. And so I see the times that we've really engaged politics and the way that science, technology, and medicine interface with these broader social and public sorts of issues as real memorable moments in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. I remember one year as a graduate student, I participated in a role play on prenatal genetic screening. I played a genetics counselor, and so we tried to use alternative formats to bring some of the ethical issues regarding genetic counseling to the broader ARST membership. That was a really memorable one for me as well.
Would you like to say anything about the Gaonkar affair?
Would I like to say anything about the Gaonkar affair? That was the question. I think Sonia Johnson's right when she says, what we resist persists. And so one of my frustrations as someone who really wants to propel the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine forward, and someone who believes that we have so much to offer, both the field of rhetoric studies, the interdisciplinary subfield of rhetoric studies, but also science studies more broadly, is that I feel that the attention that was placed in the late 90s and early 2000s on the Gaonkar affair, on the globalization thesis and the critique of rhetoric therein, really turned our attention inwards in ways that may have slowed down, may have tampered our ability to reach out to broader constituencies for our work. And so for me personally, I remember leaving a pre-conference, I don't remember what year, but I was very frustrated because almost all of the papers started with Gaonkar. And I felt that the work that we were doing independent of Gaonkar had so much to say, and I was really struck that we just seemed to be stuck. And so I was glad at the 20th anniversary pre-conference yesterday that the globalization critique did not come up.
Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the field in terms of how we refer to it? Because it seems like it started as rhetoric of science, then Carolyn Miller added the T, rhetoric of science and technology. And now it seems everyone's fairly comfortable with talking about the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. And you're, I think, a big part of that.
From my point of view, the rhetoric of medicine is one of the most exciting growth areas within the rhetoric of science and technology. And in some ways, the rhetoric of medicine is slightly different than the rhetoric of science and technology because medicine isn't purely a science. It's also a healing art and a set of practices that have different standards, different evidentiary standards than some of the purely scientific work that some of my colleagues study. And yet, if we look across the Rhetoric Society of America, if we look across what's being published in our journals, if we look at book titles recently, we can say that rhetoric of medicine, medical rhetoric, rhetoric of health, it goes by many names, is a major growth area. And so last night at dinner, actually, with John Line and John Angus Campbell and David Depew, we were joking about changing the name yet again to IARSTM, which would be the International Association for the Rhetoric of Science, Technology, and Medicine. And we had lots of jokes about whether it should be a lowercase I or an uppercase I. You can imagine where that went after the pre-conference. But nonetheless, I think that like the NCA itself and other scholarly associations, names change to reflect changes both within the broad culture but also the specific academic culture. And so I think that medical rhetoric's growing force is something to really be excited about and that we should celebrate within ARST more broadly.
What do you see as the significant tensions or resilient sticking points over the last 20 years of the field of rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
Over the last 20 years, the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine has had to persuade some external constituencies for its legitimacy. And so first we had to prove the so-called hard case that science was itself rhetorical. And I'll let many of the other scholars who've been interviewed speak to that issue in particular. When I came on board in the mid-1990s, one of the sticking questions was whether rhetoric, this 2,500-year-old tradition, was an adequate analytic art to be applying as a meta-hermeneutic to scientific and technical discourse, that so-called Gaonkar affair that you mentioned before. An additional controversy that I think rhetoricians of science have had to negotiate is how we position ourselves in relation to our objects of analysis. Are we, first of all, just trying to provide insight and understanding? Are we just explicating how rhetorical texts related to science, technology, and medicine work? Are we to be advocates? Are we to be creating public fora? Are we to be some sort of public intellectual? So I think that question really has persisted from my graduate school days, where I remember a bunch of us in my cohort who were doing rhetoric of science would have these heated discussions about our purposes. That question has not gone away. I think the so-called Gaonkar affair has been laid to rest, and the proof is in the pudding with all of the books and all of the international engagements that so many of our leading scholars have. But I think we're still asking ourselves this question of what should be the end of our scholarship or the ends of our scholarship. Are we mere analysts? Are we activists? Are we public intellectuals? And where does each of us fit on this broader spectrum?
You talked a bit about some of the early challenges facing the rhetoric of science in terms of kind of proving the hard case that science is indeed rhetorical. What are some of the biggest challenges for scholars of rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine looking forward to, say, the next 20 years?
One of the areas that I think younger generations of scholars or up-and-coming generations in rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine are facing is how to position themselves in a changing academic environment of scarcity. And so this raises all sorts of questions for the humanist. Does the humanist become handmaiden of the big sciences or of the medical establishment, right, in helping with grants and providing, the ethical and communicative dimensions of grants? Can we carve out a unique space and voice for us? And I think in the medical humanities, there are a number of us who are successfully able to make the case and carve out a unique space for us where we're not purely handmaiden, but where we are trying to be relevant and are trying to really weigh in on some of the key ethical and communicative dilemmas regarding healthcare for the 21st century. But this is a real challenge, and I think that it's changing the face of scholarship in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. And so one of the conversations that I've heard both at the Rhetoric Society of America the pre-conference on medicine, health, and publics, and at our more recent 20th anniversary spectacular, was this question of method. Because do we, in order to take our skills and our knowledge that we have to contribute to broader audiences, do we need to use the kinds of evidence, methods, and reasoning that are appropriate to those other constituencies? And those often happen to be more social scientific types of methods. And so we had a really productive and interesting engagement at RSA this spring about to what extent can and should rhetoricians be employing social scientific methods in order to make ourselves more palatable to granting agencies, medical schools, science shops, and so on. And I think that that's a question that's probably not going away anytime soon.
So can we talk about your work a bit here? What do you see as your biggest contribution to the rhetoric of medicine?
I see myself as having made two primary contributions within the rhetoric of medicine. The first is my book, Scientific Characters, Rhetoric, Politics, and Trust in Breast Cancer Research, which takes a classical rhetorical concept, ethos, combines it with persona and voice, and really tries to put a postmodern 21st century spin on how we might understand the role of character in complex biomedical controversies that extend well beyond the confines of the laboratory. So I saw that project as both trying to build theory, but also trying to add texture to the rich nuances of a case that had profound implications for the health and perceived well-being of the broader American public and women with breast cancer in particular, not to mention the scientists. So this was a case that I tried to use in order to build theory related to the rhetoric of medicine. The second major contribution that I'm working on right now is editing a special issue of the Journal of Medical Humanities. And this is an issue that's about medicine, health, and publics. And what I'd like to do is see scholars in the rhetoric of science, and particularly the rhetoric of medicine, turn their attentions to what insights derived from publics theory can contribute to our understanding of scientific and medical practices. So just as in the rhetoric of science, early work really privileges canonical figures or privileges the doctor-patient relationship, what I'm really trying to do in this special issue is turn that on its head and say, how do publics that emerge around controversial issues push biomedical research and practice in unintended ways? And what sort of rhetorical strategies can they employ? How might we understand these publics and what they can contribute to biomedical research and practices?
And can you talk a little bit about your current research beyond that?
Yeah.
Maybe some of the
Sure.
bioterror stuff?
Sure. My current research is a book project that's entitled Envisioning Viral Apocalypse, a Rhetorical History of Biological Weapons from the Post-Cold War to the War on Terror. And this is a book that tracks the changing fate of biological weapons research in the United States and looks at the way in which our understanding of the threat of biological weapons changed from a sort of post-war, Cold War concern with Soviet biological weapons getting into the hands of rogue states or terrorists to a full-blown concern with bioterrorism following the anthrax mailings of 2001. And I'm tracking this particular set of discourses and risk understandings around biological terrorism across official scientific and entertainment media. And so I have sort of three different domains that I'm looking at, these mutually influencing spheres of influence. And it's all unified by this vision of a pandemic unleashed by a biological weapon that would cause the total collapse of civil society as we know it, a sort of 28 days later phenomena. And so I'm tracking this vision. It's a very ancient vision, but I'm looking at how that gets re-inscripted in the post-Cold War and post-9/11 period.
So in your own work, and perhaps more broadly, what do you see as rhetoric adding to studies of science, technology, and medicine?
I see rhetoric adding two dimensions to the study of science, technology, and medicine. First, I fervently believe that rhetoric gives us a rich analytic vocabulary that, particularly combined with contemporary and postmodern social theories, can help us to understand the operations and political dimensions of discourses and practices surrounding scientific technology, scientific, technological, and medical rhetorics. Secondly, I believe that rhetoric supplies a productive art. And so I very much appreciate recent work in rhetoric of science that tries to help further discourse around particular issues by speaking to not only the implications of discursive choices, but also discursive choices that could be made in the future. In her wonderful essay on manufactured scientific controversy, Lisa Keränen ends her essay by giving interventions that stakeholders can make in controversies where perhaps the real interests of the stakeholders are hidden and scientific controversy is being manufactured for political ends. And I think that this goal of laying out some possible discursive moves to counter this is a really useful track for rhetoric of science scholarship in general.
What does science add to the study of rhetoric? One of the themes that I heard in the preconference yesterday was that rhetoric of science needs to add to rhetorical theory more generally. So can you say something about the domain of science as a particular context and I think that scientific characters is a perfect example of kind of how that might happen.
There's a great deal of traffic between scientific and popular discourses. And so even if we retain our sort of humanistic core, some of the language, some of the vocabulary of science is very useful even for thinking about how rhetoric operates. And Priscilla Wald does just this wonderful job in her book Contagious of looking at how scientific ideas about contagion in turn and bacteriology sort of in turn are shaping academic discourse. And I think there's a lot to be learned from her study. She's an English professor who doesn't identify as the rhetorician of science, and yet that look at precisely that traffic between scientific discourse and popular academic and even entertainment discourse is a really worthwhile move.
What telos has your work taken? Who really is your primary audience? Is it practitioners of medicine? Is it other scholars? Is it scholars in other fields? Is it the public more broadly? It's hard to pick just one purpose, but could you talk about kind of the different orientations that you've taken towards telos in your work?
Let me first say that in terms of the ends, the telos of scholarship in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine, I believe that we need to have a rich ecology. And so I don't want to specify that I think we should be doing one type of scholarship. I want a wide range of scholarship with different purposes and ends, and a healthy community where we can respect people who work with practitioners just as much as we can respect those who say, I'm not comfortable with partnering with a stakeholder agency. I want to do my close textual reading, which is very valuable in and of itself. So first, let me say that I want there to be a really wide and rich ecology within which so many different types of work can flourish. In my own work, I've changed positions a lot on what my ends were and who my stakeholder groups were. And I think that for each project, I've had a slightly different audience in mind and perhaps different partners in mind. Early in my career, perhaps before administrative loads took over my life, I was very committed to this idea that I was always going to write companion pieces, one for a rhetoric audience and then one in partnership for a broader medical audience. And so one example of that is that after my bioethics work in a hospital, I was absolutely haunted by end-of-life discourse, and I wrote an essay that appeared in the Quarterly Journal of Speech about end-of-life discourse. But I also then partnered with a physician and his team from the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, and there used some social scientific methods. We did focus groups with physicians, but we also did an intervention that was geared towards improving end-of-life communication, and that was a co-authored piece that came out in Academic Medicine. And so that's an example of where I tried to speak to a primarily rhetorical audience, but also reach broader medical audiences. The same is true with some of my more recent work in the medical humanities. So, for example, I wrote a piece on Morgellons disease, which is a contested illness for a health humanities reader, but then I'm also teaming up with Jen Malkowski to do some work on Morgellons for a rhetoric audience. So I see these two things as working together again. And then, of course, in other projects, I've just aimed for a rhetorical audience, but it really is dependent on the project, who I'm partnering with or not, and the specific nature of the cases I'm looking at.
So looking towards the next 20 years, what do you see as future directions? What are the exigencies or topics or methods that we might pursue for the future of rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
I'm really excited about potential future growth in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. I think that over the course of the next 20 years, we'll see our methods shift a bit. And I already spoke today about the shift towards incorporating more social scientific methods, but again, under a humanist and sort of broader ethical critique. I think that I'm also interested to see certain growth areas in the rhetoric of medicine and health. And every time I go to RSA, I'm so heartened by seeing the enormous growth in these areas. But I think that we need to turn away from the analysis of particular text to some of these larger scale collaborative projects. And so a third thing I'm looking forward to in the next 20 years is watching rhetoricians of science and technology and medicine form their own teams and form interdisciplinary teams to tackle some of these projects that are larger scale, that require teams, and that allow us to contribute to some of the more pressing 20th century concerns, climate and health being chief among them.
So what kind of sage advice do you have for graduate students or young people starting out in the field?
My advice to those who are starting out in the field is first to take advantage of the rich community of scholars that we do have in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. And one of the reasons that I became a part of this community was because some of my forebearers really reached out to me and really embraced my scholarship and mentored me and made me feel like I was part of something that was larger than myself. And so I would say to young scholars who are just coming up, take advantage of your mentors, find cross-institutional mentoring partnerships, and really try to have productive ongoing relationships. Secondly, follow your passion. Don't just write about something because you want to be your advisor's clone or because you think that this is the topic that rhetoricians of science should be studying. I'd say really look into yourself and ask yourself what's going to give you the energy and stimulation needed to really carry this project forward. So first, rely on good mentors, and secondly, find your passion.